The Republicans should say, we want to take over. We should take over the voting in at least 15 places. The Republicans ought to nationalize the voting.
And there it was, the birth of a new plan to overturn American democracy.
You know, sometimes I really feel pity for the Americans and what their country is turning into. This is apparently the most powerful country in the world, and yet one man is turning the whole thing to shreds. The funny thing is, he always has bootlickers coming to his defence at every point, 9 months out from midterms. Wafer-thin majorities in Congress. And what does Trump do? He floats nationalizing elections. Nationalizing elections in America. The constitutional gymnastics required to even suggest that. Honestly, it's breathtaking. If you love explosive content like this and want to see more, click that subscribe button.
We are 9 months away now from America's next date with destiny. November the 3rd is midterm election day in the United States. Up for grabs, the balance of power on Capitol Hill, where Republicans currently enjoy wafer-thin majorities. If the Democrats can get their act together and vanquish them, they will get the chance to tie Donald Trump and his cronies up in impeachment and investigative knots for the final 2 years of his presidency. But this week, the president made it clear that he is simply not going to allow the American electorate freely to deliver the kind of devastating verdict on his authoritarian administration that the polls are currently predicting. For the third week in a row, the president was gearing up to rig the election's outcome.
These people were brought to our country to vote, and they vote illegally. And amazing that the Republicans aren't tougher on it.
That's the president on Monday, speaking on the Dan Bongino podcast. Mr. Bongino was until recently the president's deputy FBI director. In the first of his new season of shows, it was open season for his old boss to lie relentlessly about America's elections and what he claims falsely is a plague of voting by illegal immigrants and the urgent need for Republicans to do something about it.
The Republicans should say, we want to take over. We should take over the voting in at least 15 places. The Republicans ought to nationalize the voting.
And there it was, the birth of a new plan to overturn American democracy. You'll remember the president has been on a bit of a journey recently. Last month, on 2 separate occasions, he said that because he has absolutely smashed it in the presidency, the country shouldn't even be having midterm elections in November. It was absurd, he said, that Republicans should even have to stoop to battling the Democrats again. The response at the time from White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt.
The president was simply joking. He was saying, we're doing such a great job, we're doing everything the American people thought, maybe we should just keep rolling. But he was speaking facetiously.
Just a joke, because threatening to cancel elections is, as you know, a real thigh slapper. But this week, even the White House couldn't claim he was joking when he talked about nationalizing the voting. So how would Ms. Leavitt explain that one away?
What the president was referring to is the SAVE Act, which is a huge common sense piece of legislation that Republicans have supported, that President Trump is committed to signing into law. It provides very common sense measures for voting in our country, such as voter ID.
According to her on Monday afternoon, the president was not talking about tearing up the Constitution and putting the power to run elections in the hands of the federal government that he runs and taking that constitutionally guaranteed authority away from America's 50 individual states. He was just talking about voter ID, the proposal for people to require identification when they vote, a key Republican demand that he managed never to mention, not once, in his interview with Bongino.
And speaking of breathtaking, actually, hold on, let me play you something. Because I can talk all day about what he's doing, but you need to hear it from the man himself. Clip plays. Right. So, illegal immigrants voting. That's the crisis, apparently. That's what's supposedly plaguing American elections. Millions of undocumented people just waltzing into polling stations. Except, and here's where it gets fun, there's no evidence. None. Zero. Zilch. Every single study, every audit, every investigation into this supposed epidemic of illegal voting has found virtually nothing. We're talking about a handful of cases out of hundreds of millions of votes cast. A handful. But sure. Let's nationalise elections based on a fantasy. Let's just casually suggest that the federal government, his federal government should take control of how Americans vote, because that's not authoritarian at all, is it? That's just common sense, apparently. The Constitution, that document they claim to worship, explicitly gives states the authority to run their own elections. Article 1, it's right there, black and white, but apparently that only matters when it's convenient. And the sources backing this narrative? Dan Bongino's podcast, his former deputy FBI director. Hardly what you'd call independent verification, is it? It's not journalism, it's an echo chamber with a microphone. They're not asking questions, they're feeding lines. This isn't about election integrity. It never was. This is about control, pure and simple.
Unfortunately for Caroline Leavitt, the next time the press got to talk to him, the president completely undercut her and doubled down. And listen carefully to this at length. It is the sound of the American Constitution being shredded and American democracy being derailed.
What exactly did you mean when you said that you should nationalize elections, and which 15 states are you talking about?
I want to see elections be honest, and if a state can't run an election, I think the people behind me should do something about it. Because, if you think about it, a state is an agent for the federal government in elections. I don't know why the federal government doesn't do them anyway. But when you see some of these states about how horribly they run their elections, what a disgrace it is, I think the federal government, when you see crooked elections, and we had plenty of them, and by the way, we had them last time, but go to 2020 and look at the facts that are coming out. Rigged, crooked elections. If we have areas, take a look at Detroit, take a look at Pennsylvania, take a look at Philadelphia. You go take a look at Atlanta, look at some of the places that horrible corruption on elections. And the federal government should not allow that. The federal government should get involved.
So this is really serious stuff now, and to remind you, not a single fact supports his concocted claim that widespread corruption is tainting elections anywhere in America, nor his continuing insistence that he, not Joe Biden, won the 2020 vote, no matter what criminal charges his pliant Department of Justice brings in Fulton County, Georgia, following that FBI raid I told you about last week. What he's proposing runs directly counter to the very first article of the US Constitution. It says in black and white, America's individual states get to run their own elections. It doesn't say anything about them being an agent of the federal government. The men and women who count the votes are working for their state, not for the national government. And to underscore the new threat that the president is making to the sanctity of American elections, he went even further in an interview with NBC News.
Will you trust the results of the midterms if Republicans lose control of Congress?
I will, if the elections are honest. Look, I want the last one that wants to complain. I just had a great election. They say one of the greatest elections, you will agree, ever. Won all 7 swing states. Won 84% of the counties in America. That's why the map is all red. We just had a great election.
When he wins, the election is great. When he loses, it's rigged. The voters are on notice now. He is not going to accept any kind of Republican defeat in November.
He's explaining to you exactly what he wants to do, because for him, the 2020 election is the original sin.
That's Senator Chris Murphy, a Democrat from Connecticut, sounding the alarm on behalf of his party on left-leaning MS Now TV.
Everything he does is an effort to explain away that loss and make sure that it never happens again. And I do worry that the scope of this obsession that he has right now with rigging the 2026 and the 2028 elections so that he doesn't lose again is all-consuming.
All-consuming indeed, to the point where last night Trump shared a video on his social media account purporting to provide backing for his claim that Biden lost the 2020 election that included brief imagery of Barack and Michelle Obama portrayed as monkeys in a jungle. The White House says people complaining about the video are engaged in fake outrage.
And speaking of control, actually, hold on, because this is where it gets properly absurd, right? So the White House trots out Caroline Leavitt. To explain away his comments, she says it's all about the SAVE Act, voter ID, perfectly reasonable. And then, he goes and completely undermines her within hours. Hours! The man cannot help himself. Listen to what he actually said when pressed on it. I want to see elections be honest. And if a state can't run an election, I think the federal government should do something about it. There it is. No mention of voter ID. None. Just pure, unfiltered. If I don't like how you're running things, I'm taking over. And here's the thing that should make everyone's blood run cold. He only ever questions elections. He loses. When he wins, one of the greatest elections ever. His words, 84% of counties, the map's all red, beautiful, tremendous. But 2020, rigged, corrupt, a disgrace. And now he's preemptively setting up the same narrative for November. Senator Chris Murphy put it rather well, actually. Everything this man does traces back to 2020. That's the original sin he cannot let go of. The obsession with ensuring he never loses again is, in Murphy's words, all-consuming. Honest elections, but only when the results favour him. That's not democracy, that's conditional acceptance of democracy. And those are fundamentally incompatible concepts.
Outrage of an undeniable kind came this week from survivors of Jeffrey Epstein.
Accountability seems to be very hard won in the world today, and particularly in this country.
That is Anuska DeGiorgio, one of the main prosecution witnesses at the trial of Epstein's girlfriend, Ghislaine Maxwell. She says she felt utterly betrayed last Friday when personal information that was supposed to be shielded from the public was included in the 3 million pages of Epstein documents released by the Department of Justice.
I got a sinking feeling in my stomach. And in some ways it was like the sinking feeling of being traumatized by the perpetrators, being re-traumatized by the perpetrators. But this time it felt even worse because the current administration were meant to be releasing the files responsibly.
Thousands of pages were sloppily redacted. The documents sparked nightmares not only for Epstein's victims, but also, of course, for our own Prime Minister, thanks to the revelations contained about Lord Mandelson, for Bill Gates, for Elon Musk, for Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick, and for Barack Obama's former White House counsel Kathy Rumler, among many others. But not, of course, for the President, speaking aboard Air Force One hours after the document's release.
I didn't see it myself, but I was told by some very important people that not only does it absolve me, it's the opposite of what people were hoping, the radical left.
Absolution is not yet completely guaranteed. Included in the documents is a summary of tips provided by the public to the Department of Justice that detail horrific allegations about the president's conduct. But there is no indication that investigators found any of those claims to be credible. Some of them were second-hand in nature, and some included no contact information for investigators to pursue. Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche insists there's no cover-up.
We did not protect President Trump. We didn't protect or not protect anybody. I mean, I think that there's a hunger or a thirst for information that I do not think will be satisfied by the review of these documents. And there's nothing I can do about that.
Congress is now demanding testimony not only from Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, but also from Lord Mandelson.
And speaking of incompatible concepts, actually, hold on, because this is where it gets properly grim, right? We're not just talking about election rhetoric anymore. We're talking about the cultural rot that accompanies it. Because while we're dissecting constitutional violations, Trump's out there sharing videos on social media that reportedly depicted Barack and Michelle Obama as monkeys in a jungle. Monkeys in a jungle. A former president and first lady of the United States. And the White House response? Oh, people complaining about this are engaged in fake outrage. Fake outrage. Fake outrage. I'm sorry, I need a moment here because what exactly would constitute real outrage in their estimation? What threshold must be crossed before we're permitted to be genuinely disgusted? This isn't some fringe account sharing this filth. This is the sitting president of the United States, amplifying racist imagery on his official social media platform. And conservative leadership? Crickets. Absolute silence. The accountability that should flow from the top of that party simply doesn't exist anymore. And here's what gnaws at me. This isn't accidental. These aren't mistakes. This is deliberate cultural warfare designed to normalize the abnormal, to make you so exhausted by the constant stream of offensive content that you eventually stop reacting to it altogether. That's the strategy. Overwhelm, desensitize, repeat. The MAGA movement isn't just threatening electoral integrity, it's corroding the basic standards of human decency that makes civilized discourse possible in the first place. And apparently pointing that out makes us the hysterical ones.
Democrats want millions more pages released by the government. On Monday, former federal prosecutor Ankush Kaduri told Tom Swarbrick on LBC that dumping everything into the public domain was never a good idea in the first place.
There is a reason we in the U.S. have never dumped all of the material from a criminal investigation, the raw material from a criminal investigative file, into the public domain. Because it was always going to do what it has done, which is produce more conspiracy theories and more questions. This would have been obvious to anyone who is familiar with human nature, how the internet works, and the linear progression of time. This is what was going to happen.
In other words, the Epstein scandal is not going away. Other news this week saw a promise by the government to pull 700 masked ICE and Border Patrol agents off the streets of Minneapolis, but leave at least 2,000 of them in place. And that news will not have gone down well with Bad Bunny. I don't know if you're familiar with his oeuvre, but the Puerto Rican legend of reggaeton will star in the halftime show at Sunday's Super Bowl. Last weekend at the Grammys, he infuriated the White House by demanding ICE agents should be removed entirely from the streets of America.
Before I say thanks to God, I'm going to say ICE out.
This Sunday, he will be performing, perish the thought, in Spanish. So for the first time ever, there is to be an alternative, unofficial halftime show in which pro-Trump singer Kid Rock will perform in what is being billed as an all-American event. We are even at the point now where the country can't come together in the middle of the Super Bowl for a celebration of America's diversity.
And speaking of hysterical ones, actually, hold on, forget that for a second, because this is what genuinely keeps me awake at night. We've just watched a country that supposedly prides itself on being the beacon of democracy, the shining city, on the hill and all that, and it can't even come together for a halftime show anymore. A halftime show. But that's the thing, isn't it? That's the symptom of something far more corrosive. Look, I could sit here and rant about Kid Rock staging some bizarre, all-American counter-programming because apparently reggaeton in Spanish is too threatening for the MAGA crowd. I could. But honestly, that almost feels beside the point now, because here's what matters. Here's what actually matters. Everything we've discussed today, the baseless fraud claims, the constitutional overreach, the racist imagery being shared from official accounts, the cultural fracturing, it all points to one inescapable conclusion. This isn't going to fix itself. So what do you actually do? You vote. That's it. That's the whole thing. You stay informed, you engage critically, you don't let the exhaustion win, because that's what they're counting on, fatigue. They want you overwhelmed and disengaged. And I know you're tired. Believe me, I'm tired. But democracy isn't a spectator sport where you get to sit out when it gets uncomfortable. Tell me in the comments, are you registered? Are your friends? Because right now, that's the fight. That's the whole fight. It's the bamulkamimd.
What the president was referring to is the SAVE Act, which is a huge common sense piece of legislation that Republicans have supported, that President Trump is committed to signing into law. It provides very common sense measures for voting in our country, such as voter ID.
According to her on Monday afternoon, the president was not talking about tearing up the Constitution and putting the power to run elections in the hands of the federal government that he runs and taking that constitutionally guaranteed authority away from America's 50 individual states.